because this broken road prepares your will for me. Help me to win my endless fears. You've been so faithful for all my years. With one breath you make me new. Your grace covers all I do. Well, I will walk by faith, even when I cannot see. Well, because this broken road prepares your will for me. Well, I'm broken, but I still see your face. Well, you've spoken, pouring your words of grace. Well, I will walk by faith, even when I cannot see. Well, because this broken road prepares your will for me. Well, I will walk by faith, even when I cannot see. Well, because this broken road prepares your will for me. Well, hallelujah, hallelujah. Well, hallelujah, hallelujah. I will walk by faith. I will walk by faith. I will walk by faith. I will walk by faith.
Second Corinthians chapter 4. Verse 6. It says, "For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us." Brother David, would you lift this up for me, please?
Well, Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for allowing us to come into your house and hear your words preached. Lord, help us to be mindful that this is not a bunch of people's writings. This is the Word of God. And that if we want to be Christians, if we truly want to follow you, then we have to hear these words. We have to do these words. They need to sink into our heart. They need to be there for us to fight Satan with. They need to be there for us to each day remember what our job is, serving God. Lord, help us to be attentive, to be doers of the word and not doers only. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. You know, Paul was battling a difficult battle during that time. In the verse before this, it talks about, or the verses before this, it talks about how he was battling against the god of this age, or the god of this world. And the problem was that the god of this world was aggressively trying to blind people from the truth. And that's not any different than what it is right now. Satan is still actively working right here today, not just in the world, not just in our country, not just in our state, but right here in Greene County. Satan is actively trying his very best to hide the most important truth that's ever been spoken of. And that truth is simple. It's Jesus Christ. And yet, here we are, we find in this second letter to the church at Corinth some interesting words about this treasure in earthen vessels. You know, in Isaiah 64, it talks about how He is the potter and we are the clay. And there's these analogies all through time about how the potter, God the Father, how He molds us and works us. And sometimes the most painful place to be, but yet the best place to be, is in the middle of the potter's wheel. As He molds and shapes us and works on us and tries to turn us into something that we can use. I have a bad habit of calling myself unworthy. I have a bad habit of not having any faith in my abilities. Too little faith. And I have a bad habit of thinking perhaps too less of me than what I should. And sometimes little things remind me of how it ought to be done and how things ought to be. And so I brought with me tonight these 3 little pots. Now this first pot, now I'll be honest with y'all, you're going to have to use a little imagination here, because if I'd have had my way, I'd have brought 3 good size pots. I don't even know if do we have big ceramic pots around our house? I didn't think so. I didn't just spot any just right off the bat. And I didn't really spot any here, but I found some pots. But now this one here, I'm going to tell you something about this one. That rascal, man, is that sparkling? I'm telling you what, the light shines off of that better than it does Brother David's head. I was expecting him to say that's 1. Only problem is, that's about 99. But that rascal there, it doesn't need any help from anybody to look pretty. It's just wired up just to look shiny and pretty all by itself. In fact, it doesn't need anything in it. It don't need anything around it. It just sit there all by itself and look pretty. You know, that's the problem with some people in the world. They get all of their glitz and glamour focused off of just things that they have. Their own talents that they've worked hard to create. Not the things that God has created in them, but just the things that they have made themselves very good at. So they don't need a lot of extra things. And they want all the focus and all the attention to just be on all the glitz and the glamour. Only problem with that is, when you look inside, oftentimes there's not a lot of glitz or glamour. Oftentimes inside what you find is just a bunch of plain old emptiness. Well, that's probably not a very good pot to describe how I often think of myself. But I got another pot. Now this pot here, this rascal here, I like this pot. Now I'll admit, it's just kind of plain. Nothing real fancy about it. But you know what makes that pretty? It's what's inside of it. Now that's just kind of, you look at that rascal and you really and truly don't focus on the pot at all. You might have held this in your hand and not really realized that the pot was orange. You probably never paid it any attention. You didn't think about the holes cut in it. You didn't think about anything in it. You thought about, man, you thought about how pretty it was, and then you thought, well, I don't want to be the one holding it. Because Brother Philip couldn't give these things back to me quick enough. So, and Miss Bonnie just sat there with her arms crossed. Once she gave it to him, she wasn't touching it again. So, but man, that's just pretty. And the truth is, it's not what's on the outside that matters. It's what's on the inside. And you know, in this world, you find a lot of people like that. On the outside, they're just plain Jane. Nothing special about them. Nothing unique about them. But man, just something about them seems to just ooze out of them. Something bright, something shiny, something good. I'm reminded of a story in 2 Kings chapter 4. Elisha had a friend. In fact, his wife, when she went to talk to Elisha, said, "Thy servant." And Elisha's servant, this friend of his, had died and left behind a wife. Now, the only problem with that story is he'd left her broke. She didn't have any money. She didn't have any way to pay the bills. She didn't have a means to get things done. So she goes to Elisha and she asks him for help. She needs to know, what can I do? And Elisha asked a simple thing. He said, "Do you have any oil in your house?" She said, "Well, I've got a little bit." He said, "I'll tell you what you do. You and your son, y'all go out and you gather up every empty vessel you can find. Just plain old ordinary vessels. Nothing fancy. I just need them to be empty. That's all I need. Just you go around and you gather up every empty vessel that you can find. All of them that you can find." So she starts doing that. She goes, gathers all these vessels up. Then he tells her, "You go to your house, you take that little pot of oil you got, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to start pouring it into each one of those vessels." Now here she was with a house full of empty vessels and just one little bitty tiny pot of oil. But you know what she did? She did just what the prophet told her to do. She went in there and she took that first empty vessel and she began to pour the oil into it. And that rascal filled up to the top and she handed it off and set that aside, and then boom, she starts filling this one up. Well, something ain't right here, because she keeps filling it up. And this little bit of oil she's got, it fills up this second one. Well, then it's full, she sets it aside. Well, then she goes, gets another one. She starts filling that rascal up. And before you know it, instead of a house full of empty vessels, she's got a house full of vessels that are full with this oil. Well, now that's done, what am I supposed to do with it? And Elisha tells her, "Now you go out and you sell all of that, and that'll pay all your bills. That's going to take care of all your needs." Now, when she ran out of vessels, the oil ran out. But she had all she needed of the oil. I got to think about that story, and I thought, man, that's pretty awesome. She just goes around, gathers up all these empty vessels, and somehow or another, God uses this little bit of oil to fill up all these just plain old everyday vessels. And that was the answer that she needed in her life. It's amazing to me that God can use something so simple. But yet, when I understand that the analogy I find in that story is me and you, we're those empty vessels. And all throughout the Old Testament, you hear the analogy of God's Spirit being like oil. And we just allow ourselves to be found and allow ourselves to be filled, then we can allow ourselves to be used for whatever God's purpose is. Not my purpose, what God's purpose is. You know, years ago, I was blessed to turn on the television. And I mentioned this just a few weeks ago about this guy. He was tall, slender. He had a good smile. He had just these piercing eyes. For really and truly, what most would call an attractive man. But he had this powerful voice, this really good speaking voice. And he was a very talented speaker. And he looked really, he was easy kind of to listen to. There wasn't anything really all that fancy about him, but he was just good to listen to. And God used Billy Graham to preach to thousands. And I'm going to be honest with you. the first time I ever turned on television and saw him in a stadium full of folks, I enjoyed that message. I enjoyed listening to him. I got a lot out of that. I kind of liked that. Now, he had a lot going for him. Although he was kind of plain, he did have some gifts that God used, and he allowed God to use through him. But the same God that used that tall, slender man with a good voice, with a good use of English language, let me tell you what else he used. In the 19th century, there came an uneducated shoe salesman who was overweight and didn't speak very well. He had a third-grade education, and basically they said when he spoke, he murdered the English language. In fact, when he would use the word Jerusalem, it basically came out with just one syllable. I don't know how you even do that. And one of the stories on him was that when he was talking to this group of educated pastors, he opened his sermon with this statement: "Don't never think that God don't love you, for He do." This uneducated shoe salesman, overweight. I've seen pictures. He wasn't very pleasant to look at. His name was D.L. Moody. And here we are over 100 years later. And the work that he did on this earth, the work that God did through this vessel, is just amazing to me. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, if you were to flip back over, and you don't have to, and I'm going to get better at putting verses in the PowerPoint again. I just hadn't gotten very good. But in 1 Corinthians in chapter 1 in verse 26, here's what it tells you about the vessels that God uses. In chapter 1, verse 26, here's what it's going to give you as an example. It says there's not very many wise men, there's not many mighty, and not many noble that are called. But if you just look over to verse 30, just a couple of verses over to the right, here's what you're going to find. You're going to find that these non-wise men, these non-mighty men, these non-noble men, here's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to get our wisdom, our righteousness, our sanctification, and redemption through who? Through Christ. Now, D.L. Moody was not the most common man. He was not the most easy man. In fact, what most people would probably describe D.L. Moody as was a crackpot. I don't know if you got to hold this or not, but that rascal there has been through the mill and back. It just isn't in very good shape anymore. In fact, as an earthen vessel goes, or an old pot goes, that thing there probably ain't much good use. But that right there, most of the time, is how I view myself. Most of the time, I don't see me of having any real good use. Most of the time, I pay more attention to all the cracks and all the scars and all the damage and all the things wrong that I've done, instead of just allowing this broken vessel, this old cracked pot, to be used by God. Then you look at this and you think, now wait a minute. How on earth could God use a cracked pot? Well, there's a beautiful Chinese fable. It's about a Chinese woman who every day had 2 pots. And every day she would go down to the watering hole and she would fill both pots full of water. And she would put the handle of both pots on this pole and she would walk with them back to the house. The only problem is one pot had a big crack in it. So she would fill both pots full. And as she would walk the path going back home, the one pot with the crack in it would leak water. So every day, for years, for 2 or 3 years, every day she did the same thing. She'd take the good pot and she'd take the cracked pot and she'd go down there and she'd fill them full of water and she'd put them on her pole and she'd carry them back to the house. And every day when she got back to the house, all she had was a pot and a half of water instead of 2 pots. Now, the good pot, the solid pot, the pot that didn't have any cracks in it, now it held water well. It was a good strong pot. It didn't have any flaws, didn't have any cracks, and it didn't spill a drop. But as the years rolled by, this cracked pot felt worse and worse and worse. And finally one day this cracked pot spoke to the woman and said, I don't know why you carry me to the water day in and day out when all I'm going to ever do is leak out half of what you put in me. I'm not of any good to you. You need to just set me on a shelf and don't use me anymore. Find another pot that's like that good pot. That way you won't lose any water. And the woman looked down at the pot and she said this, have you not noticed the flowers? And the cracked pot said, I don't know what you're talking about. She said, I realized that you were broken. I realized that you leaked. And I realized that what I put in you was going to come out, part of it, every day, every trip. And so along the path that we walk every day, on your side, I laid down some flower seeds. And every day over the last several years, as we would walk by your side of the path, you watered that seed. And now, because you watered that seed, that side of the path has a beautiful array of flowers. But the other side of the path didn't have any. Now, the truth of that story is real simple. It does matter what we fill our pots full of. But if you're anything like me and you're a cracked pot, then you're still okay. Because God can still use a cracked pot to water a whole lot of seeds, as long as you're willing to put in you what He has for you. The truth is, it's not about the vessel. The truth is, it's not my righteousness that I need to share. The truth is, it's not my abilities that I need to share. The truth is, what I need to share is my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. That living water that I let Him fill me up with, yeah, sometimes I leak. But if I'm leaking Jesus, then just maybe, there'll be some flowers grow along the path where I've been walking and where I've been leaking. Now that's one way to look at that. The other way to look at this is, I'm supposed to let His light shine through who? Me. Right? We sing that song. I'm so glad that we get to sing that in big church and not just in kid church. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Now hang on a second. Let's go back and let's look at this pot. All glim, all glamour, all that glitter. I'm going to take God's light and I'm going to try to shine it through that pot. Can you see that light? Not much there, is there? That's amazing to me. That old pot, as far as shining light through it, just ain't much value. Well, you know what? I got this here light, and I got this here plain pot. I'll just take this plain pot, see if I can't get a little more light to shine through it. Now, if I hold that up there, can you see that light now? A little bit better. Now, this is just a plain everyday pot. But now, there's still, you can see a little bit of light coming through that rascal. Now you can focus a little bit more about what's on the inside of it. There's a little bit of Jesus right there that you can see. Well, what if I'm not even like that pot? What if I'm like this old cracked pot? This old pot that as far as holding clay or holding soil, this old pot as far as something good growing out of it, probably ain't much good for nothing. But it'll water some flowers. And I just bet that light will really shine out of that rascal. So if you're an old cracked pot, or maybe you're just one of them old clay pots that got put in the oven and didn't get all the way done. You know what they call that, right? Half-baked. Maybe you're like that. That's okay. Every day, start the day out with Jesus. Every day, get in His Word. Get in your prayer closet. Get in your relationship with Him. Take a few moments every day to refill your pot with Christ. And then along the way, let your light shine and let His water flow through you.